program. My name is Tamás Maráci. I work for Danube Institute, and we will talk about world politics and what's behind the tendencies. My guest is Timothy Burns, a professor of political science at Baylor University, USA. Thank you very much for participating.
Thank you for having me, Tamás. Delighted to be here.
Thank you very much. Professor, I would ask you exactly that what many people are interested in these times, very turbulent times. If you see the conflicts from China-Taiwan conflict to the Middle East, recently there was a war between Israel and Iran, or we see the neighboring country to Hungary, Ukraine, where there is a raging war for 3 years with Russia. If you see these tendencies, many fear that this might be a prologue to the new, maybe the third world war, and many others hope that this is only a manageable situation. Which part do you agree with?
Well, my area is old books, so I'm reluctant to dive in on this, but I guess I would say those conflicts obviously have different causes. They have particular causes, but to some extent they're also civilizational. And for example, the conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Iran and all of its proxies is a conflict over Western principles. And Islamicist principles, and so it has broader motives than just any particular interests. And that's one of the things that we're doing this week at the Danube, is look at what is Western civilization. What is this thing that is under attack by Islamicism, and to some extent also by Chinese communism.
I see. If I can stick to the previous question, I see in this conflict most of them are existential conflicts. So all the participants use all the tools they can. This way, the old, maybe liberal, rule-based international order is neglected these days. There is a Machiavellian world we are entering. And as a political philosopher, I'm asking you from that aspect, that is it unavoidable that we enter this kind of social Darwinist Machiavellian world, which the rules are neglected and the survival of the fittest, maybe.
I don't think so. And it does seem to me that there was a bit too much faith in the liberal order that was created, that Wilson attempted to create after World War I, and that the UN was spearheading after World War II, with various international law, international courts. A little too much hope in those things for peace. It's not the case, though, I think, that the alternative is simple Machiavellianism or the survival of the fittest. The alternative, as I see it, is rather a group of nations once again. Obviously, they have interests, but they also have things like pride, they have honor, they have ways of life that they're reasserting over and against the so-called international order. And so that's going to have to be managed, I think, with a greater awareness that what that liberal international order had to offer people was not simply sufficient, and perhaps there's nothing that can be simply sufficient, but its promises and its hopes were, in my opinion, rather wild.
The Western civilization or the politics have two legs, I would say, the US and Europe, and I would ask you both. And first, the US, many analysts say actually that if the US weakens, and there will be a emerging new world order with a strong China, Russia, and BRICS states, and I can continue the line, there will be a very dark future for the Western mentality. And the Western Anglosphere maybe, and in Europe too, for Hungarians too. We are close between the two realities. My specific question is, because Trump is a strong leader, and we are talking about first US and after Europe, I would like to ask you, is he the last hope of the Western world? I mean, he is very brave. Even some weeks ago, he dared to attack by bombs the Iranian nuclear facilities. He dares to act. Is he a good leader in this very perilous time?
Well, I guess I would say broadly, the United States is not going anywhere. It's not in decline, at least militarily, it's not. And Europe could recover. There's some hope, even militarily, now that they've pledged 5% of their GDP to defense. But that's going to take an awful lot of work on Europe's part. Many of those countries are spending below 2% right now. They're going to have to cut back on their social services and tighten their belts. I don't even know if they'll live up to those promises, but one can hope they will. And then more broadly, with you mentioned BRICS. That's a development that may or may not pose a substantial threat to the West. Certainly, it's something to watch, but China, I think, is weaker than it's perceived. It's still a threat. It is spending an awful lot of its GDP on the military, but there are serious structural economic problems with China, and as has been said about Russia, it's something like a giant gas station. And so I don't think that there's an existential threat militarily or economically. I think the threat rather comes from a lack of confidence in, trust in, and knowledge of the principles of the West. That is, it will be an internal problem. It is something that the threat will be not from the outside, but from the inside, or it is from the inside. And that's an old story. That's what happened to Athens in the 5th century BC also.
Yeah, and this is exactly what the Vice President of US mentioned in the Munich Security Forum to the Europeans. And my next question is about Europe. What is the geopolitical weight of Europe, in your opinion?
That, I think, remains to be determined. President Trump has, as I mentioned, finally gotten NATO to increase its defense spending. In his first term, he had requested the same, but really demanded it, and didn't have many friends in Europe at the time. They were laughing, for example, at his claim that you really can't be depending on Russian gas in the way that you are. You're going to have to develop some nuclear facilities. You're going to have to find alternative means of energy. This time, I think, in part because of the Ukraine war, NATO countries are listening. And of course, NATO has grown also. Finland is now part of NATO. And so geopolitically, I think there's some hope that Europe will be able to overcome the serious threat, which I think is from China, especially economically with its Belt and Road Initiative and the way that countries are buying into that, perhaps without consideration of long-term consequences.
I see. You mentioned there is no decline of the West. Maybe you mentioned the US, but definitely there is a crisis of the Western civilization. Can you name some symptoms, definite symptoms, in your opinion, what defines this crisis?
Yes, I suppose the major crisis is the incapacity of citizens to and political leaders to speak clearly in terms of right and wrong, good and bad, just and unjust, noble and base, and to attempt to live up to the good, to the noble, to the just. That there has been developing for some time, and one sees it especially in the social sciences, a value-free relativism that shows itself in political life, for example, with when Ronald Reagan declared the Soviet Union an evil empire, roundly condemned by the New York Times and other outlets. When George W. Bush spoke of the axis of evil, same. Evil, that seems to be a term that belongs to the remote and dark past. It's not something we use anymore. So that, I think, would be at the heart of the crisis of the West. And it would be important, I think it is important to try to understand, how did that develop? It has never been the case that there has been, prior to modernity, any lack of ability, or a stifling, you could say, of your natural ability to make these kinds of distinctions, and to hear the call to a higher way of life without questioning it, without saying, wait a minute, that's something that my ancestors believed, but I can't. So I think that's a big part of the crisis.
I see. And I checked your schedule, I mean, the thematics of your summer course in Hungary in Danube Institute. And I would be very interested if you answer the three parts of the intellectual heritage of the Western culture, what left of them in the recent postmodern European or American mentality. First, the Greek philosophy. What left of it?
Yes, well, it would... I guess what's left of it is an awful lot, I would say, but it needs to be recovered. And that means that what we had thought was Greek philosophy, what one can find in textbooks, isn't really quite what's there. What's there is something much more exciting and interesting. And that is a serious probing of eternal questions that need to be answered concerning the right way of life, whether that life is by reason or by divine revelation. And that's being recovered now. And so but the recovery, I think, needs to be very clear about what the issues are and what can be fully understood by human beings. The other alternative, of course, the major alternative, the major other root, you could say, of Western civilization is the Bible. And its attempt to really self-consciously steer, its redactors attempt to steer clear of human autonomous existence, and to rather lead its readers to hearing the call of the moral life, and to understand that that call is one that they should trust. And so one of the things that we talk about we examine in the class is that there's no biblical word for nature, biblical Hebrew word for nature. There's no biblical Hebrew word for necessity. That creation, ex nihilo, means that anything could happen, or as it's put a few times, both in the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures, nothing is impossible without God, with God, excuse me. And that we look at those two roots which are in tension with one another. They're not simply compatible, or perhaps one can find compatibilities in political practice, but for serious people, for thoughtful people, they will see contradictions, they will see incoherence, and they'll say, well, which of these is right? You mentioned Machiavellianism. Machiavelli attempts to draw his readers, all of his readers, attention to necessities, and over and against, you could say, justice, and to convince his readers that really we have to set aside the claims about justice and look more fully to necessities. And that came to be synthesized with a notion of justice, but not a fully coherent one. And we're still in that situation.
It's very interesting. You mentioned the second leg, the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Bible, what role it plays in a Western mentality. And I would be very interested if you can continue with the question that what role for Christianity left in modern times politics?
Yes.
Is there any role for Christianity?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I mean, Christianity, of course, is quite different from pagan religion to this extent that the Christianity has always, from the start, distinguished what belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God, and so it has been uniquely, I would say, indifferent to the political regime, which is the central question of political philosophy. That is, one can be a redeemed Christian in an unredeemed world in or under any regime. That Paul, for example, tells Christians to obey their rulers and does so under Nero. And so that's quite a different disposition. But something happened dramatically to Christianity by dint of the work of political philosophers in early modern period. Their attempt was really to defang Christianity. It was to eliminate it, to turn it into something that belonged to a benighted past, to make it, as Leo Strauss says, outlived, so that one would think of it as something nobody really believes anymore. That was the hope of people like Hobbes, Spinoza, Locke, Montesquieu, and they had strategies for this. And I guess I would say that those strategies and their hope to have a political life that was no longer directed by, no longer informed by anything divine, and that moved pretty far away from moral virtue. That the hope that human beings would then be fully satisfied on our own has proven to be mistaken. It's proven to be something that has led to real terrible, even terrible wars. That human beings long for something beyond the everyday, quotidian pleasures and even sophisticated versions of those pleasures, that they know that they're called to something higher. And they once knew that that call came from God or the gods. And now, in the situation of a disenchanted world, they are inclined to look to other things, not just, I'm not thinking especially of nationalism, I'm thinking rather of the nihilism that called itself National Socialism. Over and against the claim, especially of Marx, but also to some extent of proponents of liberal democracy, that this world on its own can fully satisfy us, and that we are the sovereigns. We can reconstruct the world in such a way that we can rescue ourselves from any kind of despair.
But practically, do you see that the Christian values and even the biblical teachings have any effect on the mentality of politicians making politics? I mean, Trump cites many biblical textures in public speeches. There are Christians in his government. In Europe, we can see Christian democratic traditions. But do you see that biblical teachings has real effect on making politics?
I think, yes, I do. And in fact, I think it's only going to grow. I can't speak of Europe, but in the United States, the most recent polls show that religion is actually on the rise in the United States, especially among youth. What that will look like, what kind of form it's going to take, whether it will be healthy or not, is another question. But I think that there will be statesmen whose understanding of things is more fully informed by the Judeo-Christian tradition, I think that that's bound to happen, and that in a certain way things have become a little more clarified on that over the past, say, 15 years.
And I started the conversation with three concrete conflicts, and I would finish the conversation with the idea of, because we live in a Christian civilization, I dare to mention some biblical citations, like if you are a Christian, you need to consider that if the Bible is true, all these conflicts before our eyes go in a direction with God foresaw.
With
before.
God, sorry?
With God foresaw before. He even implanted in the Bible to see the future in prophecies. And I'm interested whether, in your opinion, there is a truth in it that all the events what we see now go that way, that there will be acceleration of some final events, final global conflicts, which the prologue of the second coming of Jesus maybe.
I see. Well, there's a person in the United States who is high tech, is involved with Palantir, Peter Thiel, who is actually talking about this now. I tend not to think that we can find in Revelation, I think you're referring to the book of Revelation, any kind of roadmap for or even omens, indications of the direction we're heading in. And I think it's somewhat dangerous, actually, to think that one can find them, or comical. I remember 1990, in the run-up to the Gulf War, that there was a radio show I was listening to when I was driving in the car, and it was a call-in talk show, and people were speaking of the Beast of Babylon and saying, well, that's obviously Saddam Hussein. It didn't turn out quite that way, and I think that it would happen over and again, that the mistaken interpretations of particulars, or the tendency to want our situation to have been spoken about and to be something that we would very much like to have the divine eye on. That's something we need to be, I think, a little more careful about. Other sections of the Christian scriptures argue, for example, you don't know the day or the hour, and that the more important thing would be to store up treasures in heaven rather than to attempt to use the Bible to figure out what's going on and how we can win, or whether we should be doing this or that particular political thing in order to meet the prophecies in the book of Revelation.
Thank you very much, Professor, for participating.
Thank you very much, Tamás.
And thank you for the attention. Bye-bye.